All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everyone. My name is Laura Walker McDonald. I'm the Senior Director for Insights and Impact of the Digital Impact Alliance, and I'm very proud to be a board member for a little while longer of the CDAC network. Welcome to the second day of CDAC's 2020 Annual Public Forum on Accountability in the Age of the Algorithm, Championing Pathways to Inclusion in Tech-Driven Futures. We had a fantastic day yesterday. I hope many or most of you got to spend some time with the content. And today I will be moderating the first two sessions, which is an absolute joy. And before we start, I just want to open with a couple of housekeeping notes for you all so that you can navigate the platform comfortably. So first of all, you'll see the program tab on the left-hand side of the platform, which you can see on the image here on the screen, and you can click on the photograph of any speaker in order to view their bio. On the right-hand side, you can see questions and comments from fellow participants, and we are asking that you do that through the Adventure platform. This is where we are looking for your questions and comments during the sessions, and we'll be putting your questions to the speakers at the end of each session during the plenary panel. And so we hope that you'll add some as we go through. So if you're having any trouble with audio, it might be because you haven't connected correctly to the audio for the event. And at the bottom of the Zoom window, you might see a button that says Join Audio. If you click on that and then click on the blue command button when it appears, that should help. You should feel free to tweet about what you're hearing and seeing and your thoughts. These are the handles that you should use, CDAC 2020. The Twitter handle for CDAC is @CDACN. And another hashtag we often use is COMISAID, an oldie but a goodie. Just to confirm that this session and all sessions are being recorded and will be shared after the event. We hope you'll share them on social media as well. And then finally, the MYT team are here. If you have technical difficulties, you can use the questions and comments facility within Adventure as well if you have technical questions, or you can email the team at meetings@mformotheryt.uk.com and they'll respond to you there. So let's get started. So we're moving into the third theme of the forum today, decolonizing digital justice, digital governance, excuse me, and ethics. To kick this off, we're delighted to have a couple of pre-recorded presentations for you. The first from the World Association for Christian Communication, which is looking at the principles for digital justice and how they can be applied in a national context. So without further ado, let's move on and I'll give you Beyond the Indicators, Communicating with Communities as an Expression of Freedom, Equality and Solidarity.
For over 50 years, WACC has been convinced that communication as a human right, as a practice, as a skill and as a profession should be integral to any actions aimed at responding to humanitarian needs, achieving sustainable development, and contributing to genuine social progress. This conviction has guided our work in supporting local communities to address needs they themselves identify. We aim not to just build skills or buy equipment, but to enable people to exercise their freedom of expression, access and share information in their own language, and take part in decisions that affect their lives. In our tech-driven future, we believe that rights and inclusion, especially for marginalized communities, has to guide digital governance and ethics. Greater access to the internet and digital platforms alone will not be sufficient to contribute to sustainable development. We must promote the use of these tools in such a way that those communities most often excluded achieve greater participation, and in a way that helps create the political will for public policies that contribute to greater equity and inclusion. The Digital Justice Manifesto, a call to own our own digital future, is one guide. It was developed through the JustNet Coalition, a global network of civil society organizations, including WACC, advocating for an open, free, just and equitable internet. There are 16 key principles in the manifesto, and the slide just highlights a few relating particularly to digital governance. Key among them is the last. The digital has to be governed in a local to global manner. This approach is guiding WACC's current work with local communities in a program on communication rights in the digital age. We aim to see how the principles of the Digital Justice Manifesto can be applied at a national and regional level. The Computer Professionals Union in the Philippines is one of our first project partners in this program. Their context and digital justice issues is an important example of local activism that should guide us in rights-based digital governance.
Greetings. My name is Anna, and I am from the Computer Professionals Union in the Philippines. We are grateful to the World Association for Christian Communication for allowing us to share with you some of our work on communication rights and digital justice. The Philippines is called the social media capital of the world. 73 million internet users spend on average 9 hours daily online, nearly 4 hours of which is spent on social media alone. In 2018, it was revealed that the private data of some 1.2 million Filipino Facebook users were harvested by Cambridge Analytica. This data was used for clients of its parent company, SEL Group. Reports showed SEL operating through local proxies with clients such as President Duterte and Bongbong Marcos, the son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. This is a prime example of how ubiquitous and powerful digital platforms are in shaping our democratic processes. Another example is the proliferation of troll armies that propagate fake news. In the Philippines, marketing firms catered to politicians rely on cyber troll armies that create multiple fake social media accounts to boost their image and attack opponents. More recently, the government itself has been linked to a military-controlled network of fake accounts and pages that attack organizations and individuals critical of the administration. Digital platforms are also affecting the nature of work in the Philippines. App-based services and online freelancing jobs have increased in demand, especially during lockdown, attracting many into the expanding platform-based gig economy that currently employs millions. These jobs, however, do not offer the same job stability and social protections given to workers with employer-employee relationships. The current Philippine Labor Code does not cover informal and gig workers, and no government regulation currently exists to protect them, thereby making them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And while many Filipinos are connected to social media, millions are still left behind without proper internet access. Many are connected online, but only through free internet offered by social media platforms, unaware or indifferent of the massive troves of data being harvested and monetized by the platform. Our internet connection remains one of the slowest in Asia. It is also one of the most expensive, with a rate of $20 for 5 Mbps of internet for a month, or $184 for a 1 GB per second connection. In the face of these key issues that highlight the intersect between digitalization and social equity and justice, civil society have made some attempts to push back. In 2012, online and offline protests against libel provisions in the Philippine cybercrime law led to its temporary suspension. And amid threats of arrest and social media censorship, Filipinos are still taking to social media to air their criticism of the administration. By and large, however, digital justice is an advocacy that is new and unfamiliar for most Filipinos. There is a pressing need to unpack the global so-called digital revolution, terms like platformization and intelligification, and most importantly, how these are affecting different sectors and actors in the Philippines. We still need to identify proactive solutions to assert our rights and push for social justice in a digital world. These are the aims of the Digital Justice Project of the Computer Professionals Union which we are currently working on in partnership with the World Association for Christian Communication. We hope that in the next year, we can collectively craft a Filipino people's digital justice declaration with different actors and sectors from the Philippines, which will serve as a guidepost as we contend with the emerging challenges of our increasingly digital world. Thank you.
ANA and the Computer Professionals Union in the Philippines are one example of how WACC is working on communication rights in the digital age. For WACC, the expertise of our local partners is key to guide our work about digital governance and ethics. In our most recent consultation with our partners, we identified the following key digital justice issues. Access to ICTs by communities is important, of course, but it is not enough. We need to focus on more structural issues related to ownership, regulation, human rights, and media viability. And we should see ICTs primarily as mechanisms to enhance meaningful community participation. As a result, WACC's Communication Rights in the Digital Age program, which provides technical and financial support to local digital rights organizations, is focused on the following. Number one, supporting digital media literacy among marginalized and excluded communities. Number two, supporting community managed and owned telecommunication infrastructure. Number three, promoting the development and use of open source software among marginalized communities. And the last one is building the capacity of civil society organizations to participate in policymaking processes related to communication infrastructure and digital rights. The principles of communication rights we are promoting through our partners' projects, we feel need to be expanded and taken up by other actors in the digital rights movement. We would welcome any collaboration to move in this direction. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much to the World Association for Christian Communication for that really interesting video. It's wonderful to get a view from such a sort of a sort of country level view and really understand the context in such an interesting way. Thank you for that. They will be joining us in the plenary discussion shortly, and we'll be able to ask questions. So if you have questions or comments for them, please add them in the Eventia platform. If you can't find that, then you can add them in the Zoom chat as well. But we would prefer if you put it in the Eventia platform if you can. So thank you in advance for that. I also wanted to take a second and just reflect a little bit on what we saw yesterday in day one of the forum. Thought-provoking, challenging, and inspiring. 3 words that sum up the first day of the CDAC Public Forum in 2020. We started with the day one keynote speaker, Sabelo Malambi, who encouraged us to focus on what it means to be human. He raised the prospect that surveillance capitalism is an extension of the legacy of violence and oppression. We heard also from Emily Dwyer and Laura Carter from Edge Effect, who reiterated that AI increases the visibility and therefore the vulnerability of LGBTQI+ people, and at the same time makes them relatively invisible when they need to be included. In the Humanitarian Policy Group discussions, Ollie Luff from ODI called for a cleanup of digital litter in the humanitarian sector. Rob Trigwell talked about the need to realize digital capabilities outside of big tech. Dragana Cowering called for a new fundamental humanitarian principle focused on technology and inclusion. And Adelina Kamal called for resilience and not reliance as the basis for action. In the second session yesterday, Paul Keneally noted that digital technology was being thrown at humanitarian problems in the same way that machinery was in the 1980s. The key to this being of value is not the technology, but the partnerships. Megan Reinhard-Geil and Irene Scott from Internews talked about how rumors highlight digital divides and point to prejudice and inequality. While Ellie Kemp from Translators Without Borders warned that there was an increasing correlation between diversity of language and incidence of COVID-19, demonstrating a clear need for information about the virus to be disseminated into non-majority languages. The digital brainstorm yesterday afternoon deconstructed some of the trends and thinking in humanitarian digital tech. Meg Sattler from Ground Truth Solutions remarked that the lack of inclusive technology was partly because agencies were resisting local leadership, and that international organizations need to make more of an effort to fade into the background. Catherine Green from World Vision encouraged everyone to look at the purpose of using technology in humanitarian action. So we're not just filling up a closet of broken dreams, a collection of things that never worked, never would. Max Morell emphasized the importance of local journalism and to look at the agenda behind any agency communications. Throughout the day, there was a widespread concern that digital technology was a solution looking for a problem rather than a solution to a problem that's already been identified. And that at least is a very familiar sentiment to me. If you missed those sessions, no worries. They will all be available on CDAC's YouTube channel at the end of the week. So I'm now excited to take us to a session called Digital Humanitarianism. Is this a force for good or an extension of the white person's imagination? By the Australia-based Humanitarian Advisory Group. Whoops, I've just lost my talking points. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Because of the time difference, we've asked them to record this to ensure that we had voices from the Pacific region at this event. So we're delighted to have them here on video. Keep asking questions though, as some of the speakers will be joining us for the plenary session later. And again, those questions go in the Adventure platform if you can. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Welcome, everybody. We're so pleased that you could join us for this exciting panel discussion as part of the CDAC network event. This is a recorded session, so we can bring you the perspectives of experts from the Indo-Pacific region. My name is Beth Eggleston, co-founder and director of Humanitarian Advisory Group. We're a social enterprise based in Melbourne, Australia. And as it is in a tradition in Australia, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to introduce my co-host, Eranda, who is a leader at Humanitarian Advisory Group, and we're thrilled to have representatives from LearnAsia and Pulse Lab Jakarta joining us for the discussion today on a very timely topic about digital humanitarianism. Before we kick off the discussion, I would like to give a brief introduction of each of our amazing panelists today. So we're going to first start with Helani Galpaya, who is the Chief Executive Officer of LearnAsia, and her work is centered around net neutrality, policy and regulatory barriers in internet access, e-government and broadband quality of service. She's also currently researching how experiences and perceptions of harassment, surveillance and privacy impact the different ways men and women experience the internet and how online identity helps or hinders their digital and political participation. Helani is also on a number of boards and has held senior positions in the United States, where she also studied at MIT. So Maesy Angelina is the social systems lead for the United Nations Pulse Lab Jakarta. In this role, she leads a team of ethnographers and design researchers to harness qualitative insights on human behaviour to complement big data analytics for humanitarian and development purposes. She has over 10 years of experience in the development sector, working mostly on women's empowerment and behavioural research in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, India and the Netherlands. And next we have Pak Petra, who commenced as the head of Pulse Lab Jakarta in August 2019. Prior to joining the Pulse Lab, he's undertaken a range of different roles, including as the team leader of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade-funded Knowledge Sector Initiative. Pak Petra was also the director of the Eastern Indonesian Knowledge Exchange under the World Bank. Born and raised in a remote region of West Papua, he's a national of Indonesia. So I'm sure you'll agree, this is an absolutely amazing lineup of speakers that we have today. And once again, thank you for joining us. So as the international humanitarian system struggles with facing reality of racism in aid, a failure to reach so many of the most vulnerable, and a decline in resources with which to change direction, technology, data, and connectivity are often seen as the answer. But are they? Who has the power in their application? And will a tech-driven future really lead to the local leadership of humanitarian response that we're all seeking? So firstly, I'm going to go to Helani, as I'd love to learn more about LearnAsia as an organisation and some of the themes and areas that it works on. So over to you, Helani.
Thanks, Beth. So Learn Asia is a regional think tank which does research, and we we attempt to bring about better policy. So we try to find the evidence, get it in front of policymakers, and push for better policies. And what are better policies? These are policies that are pro-poor, that is, particularly help the poor and inclusive, and pro-market. So our tagline is pro-poor, pro-market, in that we think that highly competitive, equitable markets have a huge role to play in development and making things better for people. So we focus on broad infrastructure sectors, and digital infrastructure is one where we have worked on since our foundation in 2004. And we are not only, given this panel is a lot about data and artificial intelligence, we are not only a data analytics shop. We actually worry a lot about small data and the research and the evidence that comes from that. So we try to understand the level of connectivity, the kind of digital life people lead, who is online and who's not online. That's a really important theme. And how do we include the excluded, whether it's disabled people, whether it's women, whether it's rural livers, or, or people at these other various, intersectionalities, including gender minorities. Because what we see is access is not equal. So that's a big part of what we do. Now, of course, we do quantitative research, large national surveys across the global south with our partners. We also do in-depth qualitative research. We also do action research where we implement things. So for example, related to sort of, natural disasters or health-related disasters, we would, for example, look at how do we identify very early the onset of diseases? What are the proxy indicators that tell you that a disease is about to break out? So way long ago, we started working with the Rural Business Technology Incubator at the IIT Madras and another NGO in Sri Lanka to work with frontline healthcare workers to make sure the data about certain disease symptoms trickled up, and then with Carnegie Mellon University to run models on what that might indicate. Does that indicate the possible outbreak of a flu? And then how do you communicate back down to the healthcare worker and take the necessary action? So that's a combination of AI, action research, and the kind of analytics and community involvement. We, of course, do a lot of data analytics. So the DAP team, the data algorithm and policy team, we negotiated access to call detail records, which, as everyone now knows, it's one of the better indicators of people's mobility, particularly in poor countries when we don't have Internet of Things of any other kind. People walking with their phones is one of the better ways to understand where people are. We access historical and anonymized call detail records from mobile operators. And then that enables us to run algorithms and understand a whole series of things, like where people live and where they work, where they travel to work, on what routes, where do rich people live when you combine that with the reload patterns, which is a really important thing, versus where poor people live, right? What is the nature of this city? Because we understand, what are urban and rural based on zoning laws, based on population estimates on a census every 10 years. These are really slow mechanisms for understanding, infrequent, whereas the CDRs is close to real time, right? So we use all of that to understand where we live and how people work and so on. Now, in the disaster context, it's really relevant to that first stage of preparedness and mitigation, right? Not so much in the recovery and early warning. So you need to understand the baseline of where people are to understand when something hits, how that changed. We can map cities, looking at satellite imagery. Now, in the early warning, when you know when a disaster is about to hit, we've also done some work. Working with, in the Maldives and in Sri Lanka, with the government, the telecom networks, the operators, and the regulators on common alerting protocols. How do you have standardized messaging systems that automatically go out once we know we need to warn particular people, a group of people in a particular base station, for example, that a flood is coming? But a lot of our work is not just about getting that standardized message out. It's not a SMS, it's on a different channel. But then training and working with, used to be, working with the community about, there's no point getting a warning that there's a tsunami coming unless you've got the escape routes planned and how people are going to go and how the disabled people are going to be taken care of as well as other people. So that's kind of the range of work. And I'll stop there because the work, will come out, I think, throughout the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, amazing. I can, the wealth and the breadth of the work that you do just seems to really unpack the complexities of some of these issues that we're going to be touching on tonight. And I know Eranda is quite passionate about the connectivity issue, so I'll throw to him to ask you your first question, Helani.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, like Beth said, such an interesting scope of work that you're undertaking at Learn Asia, Helani. So maybe moving on to the question about access and connectivity. So I guess there are so many examples of how the impact of access to information, especially during conflict and now during the pandemic time, especially in a politically charged environment, can impact the most sort of the vulnerable communities. And this is an area that a lot of the time humanitarian actors and development actors don't have a lot of influence over. So we wanted to sort of get your thoughts and maybe for you to share some examples where connectivity has impacted vulnerable populations, both positively and negatively.
So, in our nationally representative surveys on ICTU since 2005, and we've done this in many countries, including Indonesia, but not recently in Indonesia. But one of the questions we ask is, having a mobile phone, what has been the impact of having a mobile phone? Rate on a scale of 1 to 5. So we ask, has it improved your ability to earn a living and manage your finances? Has it improved your connectivity and relationships with your friends and family and so on? There's also a question, has it and your ability to act in an emergency? And every year in every country, the highest and most important use on that question you get is your ability to act in an emergency because you have a phone. In other words, because you are reachable, right? So not just natural disasters, it could be very personal emergencies. So it is in a way the lifeline people use. Even when there are no jobs, you're still reachable and you can go check up on your family and friends or whatever. So that's a really sort of a key thing, and that's consistent over the years and across countries, right? So the importance is very clear. Now, of course, in sort of, disaster management, like I said, the understanding where people were before and where people are now is a key part to understand the difference to what happened, what is the level of displacement. Now, if suddenly the networks are shut down in a particular area, you are not going to understand that. You're not going to get that signal from particular areas. Second, the amount of sort of misinformation and I would say, whether it's hate speech or in your world, I think it's called rumors that spread about, which particular groups are more likely to have COVID and my God, why we should stay away from these people kind of rumors, which have been quite common in Sri Lanka, right? And this is spreading on social media through connective platforms. Now, the way to counter that is through more speech of the right kind through the same connective platforms. The moment governments take away that, what we are taking away is the voice of anybody, including the affected, but also civil society who can act against that speech. So connectivity is really, really fundamental, particularly when it comes to hate speech. This idea that the internet is the only way hate speech spreads and therefore let us stop the internet is really problematic. If you look at Myanmar, even Sri Lanka, countries that have racial, religious-based, hatred built up over years on print media, on TV, by politicians, by community leaders, suddenly, when an outbreak or a real problem happens, we think, shut down the internet, and that's how we should deal with it. That's actually completely false. You're not shutting down other things. You've done years of ignoring the problem. So it's this very quick kill switch solution that people, I think, turn to, which causes huge problems. And increasingly, as humanitarian organizations are relying more on the data streams coming from the people in the field, whether it's individual personally identifiable data or data from devices like rain gauges and so on, which are really key in flood situations to monitoring rain and, you know, looking at water levels. All of that is relying on this connectivity infrastructure, and you can't shut it down.
That is so interesting. And you know what? I hadn't really thought about what you were saying, Helani, before around when authorities choose to shut down the internet, and you just have that assumption that will stop those information flows. And of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've seen, you know, historically horrific crimes that have been happening, and that was all to do with radio. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And perhaps sometimes we're overly focusing on particular mediums, because that's what we hear about all the time, and we actually are not realizing that the breadth of what's actually there.
Right. And I think, you know, there could be very extreme situations where to stop the imminent loss of life, there might be justifications for very time limited, very transparent shutdowns, which are highly localized, but they need to come back on. Because even, I mean, not during the disaster or during the disasters or afterwards in the recovery stage, forget all the government actions. I mean, people self-coordinate, markets work and coordinate themselves, buyers and sellers find each other through these mobile phones. If you look at what happened during the pandemic, the fancy supermarkets were shut down and people were finding out on WhatsApp what clinics are open, where do I get this particular rice and that particular potato. These are all informal markets that sprang up really quickly because digital technology existed.
Yeah, where would we be without WhatsApp?
Yeah.
Petra, I would love to learn more about Pulse Lab Jakarta. Some of the projects that you're working on there are absolutely amazing, and it's really one of the first of its kind. So I'd love to learn more about what your organization does, and again, the breadth of the different projects that you're working on.
Thanks, Beth. And first, please just call me Petra. It's much easier. So in describing Pulse Lab Jakarta, I think it's easiest to do it in picturing two phases. So phase one of Pulse Lab Jakarta, where we were established in 2012, coming off the back of the major global financial crisis in, I think it was around 2009, 2010, and governments recognizing that the magnitude of the crises the world is facing and the speed in which these crisis situations occur require looking at other alternative sources of information or data that could be used in not only in predicting crises, but also in handling the impact of emergency situations. And I think so. Pulse Lab Jakarta originally was established to look at emerging sources of data and how these new, or let's say unconventional sources of data could be used and applied in different situations to inform policy. So in that first phase, our work was around, exploratory research, and then looking at partnerships with different data providers and identifying these sort of new data sources that could be used or applied around different policy issues or policy problems. In the second phase, where we've sort of evolved a bit further from that because now we have a couple of hundred or so prototypes and different examples of what can be done with different data. The question then that comes to us, and particularly from our major donor from the Australian government, is that how can we answer the so what question? What has actually been used? What has actually been applied? And what sort of impact have we been able to generate through our work? And so as we progress, we're shifting from an identity as being a data innovation lab to what we're trying to narrate as a analytic partnerships accelerator, where it's fine and good if you have these sort of nice techie solutions, but underlying this, in order for them to actually be applied, in order for them to actually be sustained within government systems that are semi-willing to be disrupted and adapt to new innovations, just because of the incremental nature of the bureaucracies that we work in. It's really important to nail down the aspect of partnerships, and that it's not just about the nice dashboard that you see, but the underlying analytics and what these analytics are actually providing insights on. And that's why we've also combined with from the original team that was focused on data innovations, with Maesy's team, which focuses on social systems, the small data or the thick data, actual human experiences that need to be incorporated to I guess, to balance what and validate what data is showing from big data sources. And then we've also now complemented the team, or balanced the team, with a partnerships and advocacy unit that looks at okay, so we've identified the problem through our social systems team. We've found solutions through our data innovations team. But then who are the institutions that can actually use and apply these within their particular institutional mandate? And that's where our partnership and advocacy team comes into play, Beth.
Wow, so you also have an incredible breadth, and it sounds like you're doing, have multiple sort of channels of inquiry, that you're not just, I like how you were talking about, you've got those sort of the accelerator aspect, but the fact that you're looking, you know, at what does this data actually mean, and what is that social application, which is so relevant when it comes to the disaster side of things. So I might throw to Eranda to unpack our question that we had on the data privacy side of things.
Thanks, Beth. Petra, so the area on data privacy has been a major challenge for the humanitarian sector, not just around privacy for the affected communities that is collected, but also for the donors and aid organizations. How do you think aid organizations can approach this issue while also still being able to collect the appropriate data to inform their programs?
Thanks. So one of the things that we've looked at, and it's really been highlighted with COVID-19, is that the need to focus on the underlying ecosystemic issues governing data privacy and data protection. So it's what we've seen in Indonesia. It's when you're in the middle of a crisis and then you're trying to access data and ensure privacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's just so difficult, and everybody's clamping down and protecting their data sources and things like this. So I feel we really need to use this opportunity with COVID-19 to identify what are the protocols, what are the procedures, what are the policies that need to be in place so that I'll give you an example is around access to telco data. I think with Learn Asia, because perhaps you have existing relationships and existing partnerships, the accessibility is there. But in Indonesia, what we've seen is that without these underlying partnerships or agreements in place, although the need and the benefit of accessing telco data, for instance, would be critical in supporting a lot of the policy making and action that's required. But because there's no underlying or existing agreements, even inter-government and between government institutions, that the data has not been accessible. And so, again, just the need to really understand that before jumping into the solutions and what can be done, are there the underlying protocols and systems in place that also maintain the issue around data privacy and data security? An example was we were able last year, there was a major earthquake in Sulawesi, one of our largest islands in Indonesia. And we were able to access a sample of data which was procured by IOM from Telkomsel for a, I wouldn't say not too modest price, but it was access to be able to create a prototype in understanding the nature of the data and how it could be used. And that was anonymized data in which at a certain point we could track where refugees had traveled to, and then would allow the Ministry of Social Affairs, for instance, to initiate communication. And the response to that to this sort of generic message to identified evacuees would then signal what do you call agreement from the recipient of the message to transfer to a much more identifiable data of that evacuee from what was previously anonymized data. So there's ways and means to be able to do this, but also when thinking about another experience where we were working with DFAT in Afghanistan, and Maesy was much involved in this, and the Ethics Center in Melbourne as well. I think that we actually they wanted to use and collect data on women micro entrepreneurs, and we actually then decided not to pursue this further because of possible impact of this data on the subject matter, and it really brought us to the question of, even if you can do it, should you do it, right? If you can, yes, there's all these solutions that can be applied. You really need to ask that question: should you do it? What is the underlying or ripple effect or other impacts in collecting this data? And so I think it's really important to start developing this ethics framework to be applied in data innovations and data solutions moving forward.
Wow, that is so interesting, because it goes really what you're saying to you can develop all these kind of systems, but if they're not underpinned by trust and relationships, then they may not be much good to you, which is which is fascinating. And this really speaks to my question for Maesy, which is around the accountability piece, because again, it's this idea of information moving more than just one way. And I think the international humanitarian community for quite some time was quite just focused about, there very much is a right to information, and communities and populations who have been impacted by disaster or crisis, have a right to that information. But then that question is, but what about the information that communities want to give back? The criticisms they may want to make, the feedback, the kind of information that could actually really make those response programs much better. And I'm not sure that that's the piece that has fully been realized yet. And I'd love to get your thoughts about the work you've done, Maesy, on how, sort of feedback systems and how data is impacted, especially women, in the kind of projects that you've been working on.
So my work in Pulse Lab, as Petra mentioned, is really bringing the humans and the systems back into the equation, because sometimes when people talk about technology, they think about the tools and they frame the issue as technical issues. But when is something ever really just a technical issue, right? In trying to solve problems like development, like humanitarian action, it's always also a social and political problem. And that's the perspective that my team brings into the equation. So in the early days of Pulse Lab, I think we were aware about all of this, but we also wanted to make sure that we have people who wanted to work with us, because we were new at the time. And so we have had our share of experiments in dealing with this feedback issue as a technical problem. And what we found is that it's so easy to just think of it as a technical problem. There are so many ways that can be tested. We can test different kinds of crowdsourcing, complaint mechanism, etc. There is no shortage of ways to think about what kind of technology can help you get feedback back from the community to your own program. But the main issue and the real issue is that what do communities get back once they give the feedback to you as people who are running the program, right? Because in the end, a lot of the national complaint system, whether it's built by the government or whether this is something that NGOs or UN entities have come up with, they die quite quickly because people don't get feedback. So once people have given their feedback about a particular program or service, once they have said what their complaints are, do they know whether they're actually being listened to? Is actually something different is happening? So without this part, then it's not going to be solved, and you won't really hear back from the community, and they don't have any incentive or trust to continue giving feedback to you, either as a humanitarian organization or the government or whoever entity that was asking their feedback at the first place. So in order to address all of this, I think we need to look at the ecosystem really and bring back the trust, the relationships, humans and organizations back into the picture. So now as Pulse Lab is maturing, when we look at these issues as well, sometimes the tension that we feel is that people want to place us squarely as a technical partner, but it's our job to be asking the difficult questions as well. For instance, if you want to really hear more about what communities are doing so you can do an intervention, what link do you have back with the community? Do you have community organizers working on the ground with these communities that you want to reach? Are there people that the communities can come up to and have a discussion with about things that matter to them? So we are doing the difficult work now of framing ourselves not just as a technical organization, but also a political and systemic organization asking all of these kinds of issues. So again, when it comes to accountability, as you mentioned, I think if we were to position ourselves, because Pulse Lab is part of the UN, as a UN agency, development agencies who wanted to hear back from the community, we also need to be asking ourselves, what do we, how much are we prepared to respond back to the feedback that we hear from the community? What are we prepared to give back to the community because they have actually given time and effort to say what they think and what they want to us? Yeah, so that's the kind of questions that we're raising at the moment.
And that's the very fundamental part of accountability, isn't it? You're exactly right. What has happened once that feedback or that complaint has gone back into any kind of system? What has that been acted upon? And you know, and do people have access to knowing that that has happened? So that's a key piece, I think. And I think when it comes to humanitarian response, it seems to be that you're right. Many mechanisms have been set up, but does that final step, is the loop actually closed? Do people actually get that, you know, that solution that they've been looking for? I'm keen to know now if you have any questions for one another by any chance.
I guess I always not worry, but I think about privacy as obviously a very, very serious concern in the use of data. But I think there's also other rights that I think that are important. And that has, you know, for example, things related to access to data. You can talk about it as a right. So first of all, even on the privacy side, you know, who is in the data and who is not represented in the data? What do we do about the people who are not digitally represented, since this is what we are talking about, right? So you know, we really need to worry about, you know, while we are worrying absolutely about the privacy of the people who are represented, the right of those people who are not showing up in any map to have aid or their livelihoods improved and so on and so forth, right? So the analog complement to what we are doing digitally, I think, is kind of important.
I completely agree, Helani. Yeah, about, yeah, if we're thinking about data solutions, there are always people who are going to be missed, but sometimes I feel like the discussion is too narrow, right? It's really about what do you do with the data system so these people are represented in the data sets. But I think the energy could also be spent to think about, okay, what can we do as an alternative to reach people who are not represented in the data sets, to really find out what's happening and get the help to them? Because as you said, there are other rights that needs to be part of the discussion as well. So
right.
yeah.
Yeah, and I worry that, you know, everyone is talking about how we're going to automate everything, that there's a lot of people who are systematically not showing up in digital data sets. And I guess the other thing, I mean, you know, and this is really maybe like Petra and Maesy, like this is sort of a UN kind of thing that I think about, because, you know, if you look at the disaster, sort of the preparedness mitigation kind of action that happens, right? You see a lot of private sector actors playing in this field, right? Like, I mean, Google and Microsoft saying they're working with governments to do like flood warnings and all of that, right? To develop sophisticated models. I think, you know, these are all great things. It actually saves property, it saves livelihoods, and it saves lives if we get better warning. So they do it, you know, let's say in multiple countries, right? And they are learning from the data of that country. And a lot of times there is no agreement as to, maybe even if the data of, let's say, Sri Lanka doesn't leave back to some global servers, the learning or the variables, the model details do leave. Even, you know, if you think about federated learning and stuff like that, even if the data doesn't go, other information is going. So this global entity, often private sector, will have deep insights into floods. That's great. That when that's fed back into Sri Lanka, you know, the Sri Lankan government can act in theory. But what happens in about 10 years if this company says, well, now I've built this super model because I've learned from 160 countries, now you need to pay me, right? What are the conditions of that kind of access? Because they can say, well, I didn't take your data. So, I mean, this is where there's also not just national competition issues when it comes to data. I think there really is a inter-country, international sort of coordination mechanisms kind of thing, because this is sort of becoming one big market. It's not in these, you know, national boundaries. And I think we need to think of those mechanisms. I don't have a solution, but I just see a problem, let's say.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, Helani, because we were engaged with on a project in Southeast Asia, primarily in Bangkok, and it was funded by a consortium between two European aid agencies or international development partners, but one was actually then looking to I guess monetize the application moving forward, and I feel it wasn't. It showed that it wasn't clarified from the beginning the intent and the roles of each of the partners, so that moving forward, did they actually have sort of shared values between themselves? Because it of course then created tensions. And I guess I'd like to know, Helani, in your experience, where you know, there's sort of this assumption around it's all about access to data without really clarifying on the quality of the data and understanding what are the gaps in that data itself. And so everybody's chasing these partnerships without then configuring or having a full understanding of what the data actually represents. Is that something that you've faced as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, access to data has many dimensions, right? Sort of like who has the data, who can use it in what way, under what conditions. That is the existing data. And then who can use the learnings from the model is also an access issue, right? And there's often this idea that somehow, you know, I think you see in conversations, oh, you know, governments, of course, you know, they won't do anything wrong with the data, so it's okay to give it to them, you know. I think that's not an automatic thing in some countries where the government actually could be the problem, where they use that data collected for something for completely other purposes, right? So the quality of data, again, is also, I think, multidimensional. Like we discussed before, Petra, you know, who's in the data and who is not is, I think, really, really important. Yeah. And sort of how clean the data is, what it actually represents. So, I mean, obviously, you know, I know, you know, I'm sure you work on things on, you know, how do you bring about sort of tests on, you know, even if it is black box, you know, input, output testing on what the model says, what you throw in, and, you know, what kind of biases is it throwing out at people is important. I think there's the sort of the secondary data also gets lost in this. So, I mean, if we go back again to this example of, you know, whether it's Google or whoever, a global company, you know, you can say the governments can use the outputs of the model to perpetuity, right? That's better than charging them, great. But what about private sector? Surely that is a public resource that was taken about people in a particular country, the satellite images, the rain gauge data, all of that is now being used to learn and build models. But why shouldn't other private sector companies benefit from that model? Like insurance providers for farmers, they really need crop insurance, right? Flood insurance providers. That is a resource, that data, the model or the learning or some parts of it surely should also be accessible, sure, for a fee to other people. So it's not just about private and public, but within private sector also there are, I think, real competition issues if we look at some of the public good data that is now being privatized and used.
Because I'm also interested in, and Beth, it actually comes back to, you know, your humanitarian, the Humanitarian Action Group, that around this accountability aspect, right? Many governments, let's say, are very comfortable in conventional data sets because they produce it and they control what is then reported from this data. And I guess the disruptive element of big data or alternative data sets is that you can't control what's being produced and what the data is actually showing, right? Well, you can limit how much it gets on social media, I guess, or you can try. But so I guess the question back to development actors or humanitarian actors, are we ready for this different level of accountability where the data, we can't control what the data is actually showing, and are we actually producing, or have we provided the results that we said we did?
Absolutely. And do we have the systems in place to even respond to the answers that you may get asked? And I think that's a piece as well, that you could perhaps create expectations that you will really have solutions to some of the feedback that you get when organizations may not always have that.
But isn't it also an opportunity, I guess, Beth, you know, for anyone, sort of, you know, we had huge biases in existing manual systems, right? In who we gave aid to and who we prioritized and which communities we liked and didn't like and, you know, talked about or whatever, right? So once this data is actually sort of, once it's codified and analyzable, it actually gives a huge opportunity to understand how badly we are or were doing things, right? I mean, that's what some of the datafication of, you know, obviously not really in the humanitarian space, like the famous cases of, you know, prisoner recidivism, for example, in the US. You know, what it showed is finally when it's analyzable and codifiable, you can actually see the problems with the algorithm, the problems with the humans, and maybe find better ways, you know, so find better ways of improving the overall thing. Because half the time we actually don't know. We think human systems are so good, and we only see a problem with the automated system or the algorithm, right? I think there are problems with both, and the unpacking the box and putting things in there actually might help if you do it the right way.
If you do it the right way, yes.
Can I just add a bit, on one of our experiences? Because of COVID-19, it's the first time in a while that we've had, and hopefully we won't have another one too soon, but you know, that an emergency situation that's impacting the whole country. And so what we thought is that let's use this opportunity to see how each provincial government is actually publicly reporting on COVID-19, whether it's being consistent with the standards and processes that should be in place. And we found out of 34 provinces, only 3 provinces have been consistently reporting COVID-19 publicly, you know, which includes aspects of interoperability where the data can be extracted and then aggregated at a national level, and a lot of provinces were doing a range of things, including Instagram videos to report on COVID-19 without any official clear site reporting on COVID-19. And so it really helped us to see what is actually the conditions of Indonesia's data ecosystem with regard to reporting on this, but it then highlights, issues from standardization through to perhaps human capacity, because what we saw also is it didn't correlate with provinces that actually have relatively good infrastructure, but weren't actually reporting publicly COVID-19 in a way that was easily accessible and consistent. So again, where COVID-19 can be an opportunity to gain these sort of insights on what really needs to be progressed in terms of systems and capacity, so that even in moving forward, let's say when there will be a cure or antivirus to COVID-19, that then we're in much better shape to be able to distribute and look and see the impact of the distribution of the cure.
Absolutely. We might just go to you, Maesy, for your last thoughts before we wrap up.
Sure. So what I wanted to say is that another part of the debate that I think often gets glossed over is whether governments are really that comfortable in adopting algorithms or alternative data set analysis to begin with, because this is something that we face in Pulse Lab. So Petra already mentioned before about the hundreds of prototypes and dashboards that we have built, but it's not adopted yet, right? But I think, again, we need to look at it from a systemic and political point of view. So another part of the work that we've been doing throughout COVID-19 is to work with one of the local governments in Indonesia who is more open to alternative data sets. So the problem that they had was that, well, we have a limited number of mass rapid tests that we can disperse. Where should we disperse them? And the data that's being reported usually are only on the city level or the provincial level. Can we get something more granular to the village level? And we found through a combination of traditional data sets like the Village Census Survey of 2018, so a government data set, and also the Facebook population density map, we were able to come with some sort of calculation to detect which villages, so way more granular than what was captured by the government themselves, that are at risk of COVID-19, and where you should be dedicating your resources to in terms of mass testing. So some of the early assumptions is that because this is something that we came up with together with the government counterpart, they would want to immediately take action on this right after we come up with the analysis. But no, not so fast, because, well, first of all, the people who are more open to alternative data sets and these kinds of solutions are probably the bureaucratic entrepreneurs. They exist within the system, but they're also at the fringes, right? Whereas people who are making the decisions around resources are the ones that are fully entrenched within the bureaucracies. So some of the role that my team does is now, as we are diagnosing what do we do to make sure that the tool that we came up with together with the local government is actually usable, is we're trying to help the system see itself and see what's the pathway between the custodian of our tool into the decision makers, and what are the ways in which we can instill confidence. And so even just before we're recording this session, I have been doing user research with the government counterparts in that particular local government to understand more about how they think, what are the systemic enablers and barriers. And a lot of people are excited in the government about this particular tool that can look at cases and potential risk at a more granular level, but they are still hesitant to take action because they wanted to see what's the validity. This is still alternative data sets after all. This is still Facebook population density map. Do we know what's actually happening on the ground? Can we do some form of ground truthing? So I think that's the other part of the debate that needs to be discussed as well, because a lot of people are talking about the bad impacts of calculation of algorithm, but what are the actual pathways for something that is quite experimental to be actually used for decision making? What are the kinds of systems that needs to be in place, and what are the complementary things that needs to be done? So data analytics cannot stand alone. This kind of innovation can't stand alone. Other things within the system needs to be supportive of it, but we don't talk about that part enough. And that's my last message, I suppose, for this conversation. We need to think about what else needs to be in place in order for data innovation to actually make a difference.
What a fantastic note to end on, because I think what I've really learned from you all today was the fact that we can get wrapped up into what tech can look like, the kind of data it can produce, but the fact that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And of course, really technology and how it works is a reflection of society, because it's all to do with power, really, isn't it? And you've all mentioned that the political aspect of this is really what makes it you know, a fascinating, tricky, scary kind of environment to work in. And I suppose as humanitarian agencies navigate that, that's something that they really need to keep in mind. So I thank you so much for your time and your fantastic insights for this session. We're very, very grateful to hear from you from all around the world, and to bring especially that flavor of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, because I think in many ways, the Indo-Pacific region is really at the forefront of a lot of this thinking. So it's been wonderful to have you. So we're going to stop the recording here, and I thank you so much for your time.
Wow, thank you so much to the Humanitarian Advisory Group for a fantastic panel. That was very thought-provoking. And I'm going to move right along so that we can maximize the time for the plenary discussion. And I just want to remind you once again to add questions to the Eventia platform so that we can put them to the group shortly. But before I do that, I'm delighted to welcome Anasuya Sengupta, who is our keynote speaker for today. Anasuya is the co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge. She's led initiatives in India and the USA across the Global South and internationally for over 20 years to amplify marginalized voices in virtual and physical worlds. She's the former Chief Grant-Making Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, a former Regional Program Director at the Global Fund for Women, and a 2017 Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow. She received a 2018 Internet and Society Award from the Oxford Internet Institute and is on the Scholars Council for UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Anasuya holds an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She also has a BA in Economics from Delhi University. This is my favorite bit. When not rabble-rousing online, Anasuya builds and breaks pots and poems, takes long walks by the water and in the forest, and contorts herself into yoga poses. Anasuya, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and it's lovely to be here. I'm now going to test the limits of technology and try and share my screen. Let's see if this works. And there we go. Excellent. It is wonderful to be here with you. I am Anasuya Sengupta, and I come to you from a feminist collective global campaign called Whose Knowledge. You can see two of my compañeras, Adele Vrana and Siko Bouters, in our happy picture over here. I also come to you through a journey which includes being in the humanitarian sector, and now, of course, in spaces of technology as a feminist and social justice activist from India, who now lives in London via the United States. I span many diasporas of many different domains, but it's therefore a particular delight and honor for me to be here with all of you in the CDAC community, because it feels like many different parts of myself coming together. For many years while I was based in India, headed a UNICEF project, and of course, being from India, being middle class, and being Savarna, or from the upper caste, I have embodied many different systems of power and privilege, or dispower and disprivilege, including through environmental and political crises, of which all of you know much more than I do. So for me, I just want to say, as I talk through or share my reflections today, I'm doing so with tough love. I'm doing so because I have been in these worlds. I am in these worlds. I love the possibilities of technology. I want our world to be a better place, like all of us do. And we need to ask ourselves and each other tough questions in order to create and support an equitable, joyful, just world. So moving along, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what it means to decolonize the internet, including algorithms. I'm going to talk, unsurprisingly, about power, equity, and decolonization, just to remind us of what these concepts mean in practice, and come back to what does this mean for all of us in the humanitarian sector. So let's start with who is online. It might surprise you to know that over 60% of the world is now online. Of course, we are online in many different ways and on many different devices through very differential access. Some of us much more easily than others, but 60% of the world is now online. 40% of the world is still not. And of those who are online, 75%, 3/4 of those who are online are from the Global South, from Asia and the Pacific Islands, from Latin America, Africa and the Caribbean, and all the many worlds that many of you serve and support. Of all women, nearly 50%, nearly half of all women are online. So who builds these infrastructures that we talk of when talking about being online, including, of course, algorithms? Only 5% of leadership positions in the technology sector are held by women. In the USA, women hold only 25% of computing positions. Only 5% of those are Asian women. Only 3% of those are Black. And as you can see, this continues for Hispanic folks as well. Only 6% of technical workers at Apple are Black. In fact, oops, have I just shifted my screen? No, there we are. In fact, in 2016, when they looked at 10 of the largest Silicon Valley companies, technology companies, they found not a single Black woman was employed. That was 2016. So let's go on to, once you're on the internet, what do you see? Whose knowledge is online? So our frenemies at Google did an estimate a few years ago looking at how many books have ever been published. And they found, generally speaking, there are about 130 million books that have ever been published in about 480 languages. There's an exception, which I will come to in a second. There are over 7,000 languages in the world. So quick back of the envelope calculation, only about 7% of the world's knowledge, because language is a proxy for knowledge, is in books. The most translated book in the world, the Bible, nearly 3,000 languages. The most translated document in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with over 350 languages. I want to pause here and just sort of look at this really interesting issue that most of the most translated content in the world, whether in books or in documents, is the Bible and the UNDHR. And both of those, to most of the communities that they come to and are read by, are not produced by those communities, have not really been produced in consultation with those communities. And whatever you think about the content of the Bible or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they are not necessarily specific to the context of the communities that read them or learn about them. And it's a thought to hold. So, whose knowledge is online then? Most of the online content of the world is in English. Nearly 60% of all websites are in English. Russian is a very, very lagging second. Most users who come online in English and then in Chinese. Most digital scholarly publications that include publications about humanitarian aid or technology are in English. 80% of all scientific journals and 90% of all social science journals that are indexed on Scopus and JSTOR are in English. The internet does not sound, look, read like most of us in the world. Even more importantly, the design, the architecture, the content, the governance the overall power of the internet does not reside with most of us in the world. So we, the marginalized majority, what do we do about it? We want to decolonize the internet. But we can't talk about decolonization in any sector or sphere of the world without talking about power. And I know these are conversations and questions that are very familiar to all of you listening and to all of you in the sector. But I want to remind us, because we use the word power sometimes very easily, what does it actually mean in practice? What are the questions that we have to hold, not at the back of our minds, but at the front of our minds? What does it mean to move from an individual prejudice to systemic structural power? Who does what? Who gets what? Who sets the agenda? Who decides what? And more importantly, whose story is it that we're telling ourselves? What is that story? Who is the storyteller? Whose data are we talking about? Who built the algorithm? What, actually, who is the product? At this moment in time, looking at data and big data, we are the product. We are not actually consumers. We are the product. So who is the analyst and engineer of us? What is the power behind the algorithm? Whose experience, whose design, whose leadership? As we know about algorithms, and all of you know well, algorithms can have bias in multiple ways. Two of the most important ones being that you can have bad data sets, but data sets themselves are embedded in power, right? What do we know of Black women? What do we know of brown men? What do we know of Pacific Islanders? But the answer is not to make better data sets that someone else controls. Who designs the algorithms that help us analyze this data? It's not a black box when you begin. It becomes a black box once the patterns of math continue, but someone has designed the math. Cathy O'Neill, who I think has written an extraordinary book about algorithms with probably one of the best titles in the world, Weapons of Math Destruction, talks about it as algorithms are opinions embedded in code. And I'd like to go further. They're not just opinions. They're opinions of power embedded in code. So if we want to also ask ourselves about our own sector, the humanitarian sector, we could say humanitarian protocols. We could talk about humanitarian protocols and say humanitarian systems are not just opinions embedded in protocol. They're systems of power embedded in protocol. That brings us to decolonization. That's an image from The Guardian. I found it by The Guardian. I just ask you to hold it in your head and your heart and your body for a minute. What is decolonization to me? At whose knowledge? This is the definition we often talk about. We call it the personal and systemic unpacking and dismantling of historical structures of power and privilege that govern the ways we live our lives today. Who we are, how we think, what we get, what we do, how we do. Most importantly, who is the expert, who designs, and who leads. So decolonization is about analyzing, understanding, and accepting these histories of relations between and the hierarchies of power over people, resources, institutions, non-human life, the earth, what we otherwise call colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, and many other isms and forms of discrimination, and then changing these inequitable relations into more equitable and holistic ones. It is uncomfortable. It does have to hurt. It doesn't have to hurt, to the point that it makes us wounded and guilt-ridden. It has to hurt to the point of responsibility, of taking responsibility for these historical structures and relationships. It is messy, it's unsettling, it's always a work in progress and a work in process. And it is not only about individuals. It is not only a metaphor. So we are all using decolonizing very easily these days as a word. We use it as well, as you can see. But for us, it's not just the metaphor. The metaphor helps us enter the conversation, but the conversation has to shift in practice. It has to transform structures and processes of power. It is not about efficiency, it's about equity. And equity might lead to effectiveness. In fact, we think it does, but the starting point has to be equity and power. So I want to take a minute, just maybe 30 seconds given the time, for you to look at this very familiar picture that defines equity. I dislike this picture intensely. I want you to think about why I might dislike it. Just think about that for now 5 seconds. All right, I'm going to tell you why I dislike it. I dislike it because it doesn't show the actual embedded structures of power and privilege. It looks like it's a level playing field, literally. And the infant, because of course, those we want to support through equitable practices has to be infantilized, just needs those 2 boxes in order to see. This is a much more true version of equity. Not just are we all humans together, deserving of the same dignity, but many of us humans can't see far enough because the fence is higher for us and the playing field is much, much lower. So very quickly, in terms of colonization and resources, because this is important for us as we think about aid, and I will say I dislike the word aid, but of course I've used it because we all use it in this sector. There's a very strong argument that is made that my colonial master, the British, and yes, there's an irony that I'm sitting in London as I say this, our colonial masters developed India. Oh, and they developed India in so many different ways. They gave us trains, they gave us education, it was good for us in so many ways. That is language we use to this day in many different parts of our lives. What did actually happen, which a wonderful feminist economist Utsa Patnaik found in 2018, she analyzed how much money had been siphoned out of India over 200 years, $45 trillion. In 2018, Britain's GDP was approximately 3 trillion. So Britain did not develop India. India developed Britain. Wakanda, for those of you who are fans of Black Panther, as I am, is not an Afro future. It is a possible Afro past. If this is what happened to India, imagine what colonization did and continues to do to all of us who have been colonized. So what does aid and the humanitarian sector really do? And again, remember, I ask these questions out of tough love. I ask these questions of myself as I do of you. So let's look at some of the things that decolonizing aid and algorithms might look like. It is not your money. It is not my money. This is reparations. The work we do is not charity. It is reparative. You are not the expert. Experience is the expert. PhDs don't matter when you're talking about the expertise needed to truly understand the socio-political, technical systems that are our communities. You are not the designer. So how do you center, not control, the communities that you are trying to support and serve? You are not the leader. So how can you serve and not see yourself as a savior? Most importantly, those of us who caused the problem cannot imagine or lead the solution. We can support it. We certainly must serve it, but we cannot lead it. Audre Lorde said, as she said so many brilliant things, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Most importantly, in all that we talk about with decolonization is imagination. What would Ancestor Lorde be saying to us if we asked her to imagine what an equitable, feminist, decolonized internet might look like, or an equitable, feminist, decolonized algorithm or aid? I'm going to end with reminding us that no one is free until we are all free. So decolonization liberates us all. I know you probably are all sitting with a little fear and pain in the pit of your stomach. I always do when I talk about this, but I remind myself that this will make us all more joyful. Revolution is a symphony of liberations. And what it takes, as my extraordinary feminist inspiration from South Africa, Craig Govinder, says, it takes love, it takes courage, it takes insubordination. So let's decolonize ourselves, our work, and the robots that are coming. Thank you all.
Anastasia, thank you for leaving us with the phrase, decolonize the robots, which is now, I think, my mission. That was wonderful. And I want to encourage us all not to shake off that feeling of discomfort. We have to sit with it. And I think that the humanitarian, having jumped in my career between the humanitarian sector, the development sector, and sort of broader social change movements, in the humanitarian sector, the machinery of the agencies makes it incredibly easy to not see the context in which we're operating and the political reality that serves us and that we are part of. And so this reminder is incredibly important and very valuable, and I'm extremely grateful to you for sharing those experiences with us. We have a short time to have a conversation. So I want to encourage Anastasia to stick around because I'm sure there'll be questions for her. And also we want to welcome back Anna Celestial, who's the project coordinator for the Computer Professionals Union, Philip Lee, who's the General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication. And I have lost my list now again. This keeps happening to me. I'm sorry. Yes, Petrarca Karetji, Petra, the head of the United Nations Pulse Lab in Jakarta. So this is our plenary discussion. And if you have questions for this group, please add them either on Zoom or on the Adventure platform that if you're watching there. And I have one that I might just come in with, which is sort of building a little bit on what Anastasia was saying and trying to take it back to this notion of sort of digital governance, which is, I think that the humanitarian sector is one ecosystem and community made up of governments and donors and agencies that exist in their own political reality. And then we've heard a lot about the local level and the local technological and social reality. And in the middle, there are governments. And it strikes me that the humanitarian sector in particular, while it operates within government systems, is often able to circumvent some of the digital sovereignty that governments actually hold, the ability of countries to come together as a people and notionally regulate digital and the way it works. And so we think about, for example, where governments may not have the best interest of all the people within their borders at heart, how can we not relinquish data that we're required to relinquish through hosting agreements and things like that? So how do we engage with that data governance question and digital governance question as we're planning our own programs? How do we as agencies think about engaging with governments, engaging with communities to understand what participatory digital governance might look like, how we work with communities and with governments to understand what we should be doing from their perspective with their data. I'll throw that open to anybody who'd like to tackle that rather large question. Any thoughts from anyone?
Laura, perhaps I could say something about that. It's very close to some of the work that we're trying to do at WACC. But first, I'd like to say, wow, Anasuya, that's the best keynote speech I've heard for ages, certainly this year. And from my perspective, it really pinpoints the issues that we're up against here. I think it's very clear that civil society as a whole must have a say in digital governance at all levels. It has to come from the grassroots. It has to come from the people who really matter. We have a motto here, WACC enables people to be seen and heard. And we're talking about people at the grassroots, the marginalized, the people who are left out of the conversation in many ways. I do think we all have to work together. So there is an idea out there that we need a UN rapporteur on digital rights and how that works, but not working alone. It has to be informed by civil society organizations. It has to be informed by the very people that such a person would set out to try and help. So that's my first response anyway.
Thank you, Philip. Anyone else want to tackle that one, or perhaps if I have a more specific question? Oh, so go ahead, Petra.
Sorry, Laura, it just relates like what Anasuya was saying, whose data is it? And so I think sometimes we also get rather protective about our sources because that maintains our relevance as different agencies or provides us some sort of comparative advantage. And so I think having the internal mechanisms to ensure anonymization of anonymity, I guess, but at the same time, as Maesy said in our discussion, is the data also actually being utilized by the community that it originated from, and to what extent, what is the sort of power dynamics and relationships between the government and the community? So yeah, it is a pretty broad question, Laura, but just some thoughts from my end on that.
Thank you, Petra. Anyone else want to take that one on before I can perhaps add a more specific piece, which is one of the challenges that we often think about in communities, particularly where we may be operating without that governance input from government for various reasons, is how do you conduct participatory design really with the community, for the community, of the ways in which we generate and manage the data, their data. So when, for example, a question about, do you want your data to be held within this country, is a question that might require an understanding of how data storage works and how the internet works that might take quite a long time to explain. Is that a good use of that person's time to have all of that work put in so that they can make really informed decisions and help inform your governance of data as an agency?
Oh, hi, Laura.
Hi, Anna.
Yes, I'd just like to answer about the Digital Justice Manifesto, because you were asking earlier about how data governance can be done at a local, regional, and international scales. I'd just like to bring up that in the Digital Justice Manifesto, one of the key principles is that data should be governed from the local or the national to the regional to the global levels. Because it's hard to have a single governance structure or framework that would encompass different national contexts. So I think a big part in terms of data governance is having strong or supporting developing strong social movements locally. Because as you can see, like with the e-commerce negotiations in the WTO and in the RCEP previously, it's a race to the bottom. So tech companies look for countries where there are loose data laws and stuff, and that's where they operate.
So I think we need to, different countries that face the tech monopolies have to assert, they have to put forward their own agendas so that the governments can legislate laws that would be beneficial for the people. And then from there, we can work towards regional frameworks like with the UN, etc. Thank you.
Can I just appreciate what Anna said and add a little more?
Please.
Because I so agree with Anna that there is no single system of governance. And the minute that we start thinking about that, that itself is part of the problem. And at the same time, I think, because all of us agree that power is part of the issue, we need to, accept the fact that governments are not separate entities from corporations, that especially around data, they are very much in collusion. And what we're looking for is a nested governance system, as Anna is talking about, where you can have the privacy and the consent of individuals and communities being met, but at the institutional level, there's openness of data, because that is how you ensure in some part, and I know I'm more on the radical end of this, I believe that institutional level data needs to be open in order to ensure this form of equity, which is that this data was not gathered for private means and private gains, whether that is a government or a corporation. And as we know, both governments and corporations in collusion with each other are using our data in extremely problematic ways. So that it's not an either or. I think when we talk about privacy, we often talk about it as either or. It's actually a polarity between openness at systemic level and privacy at individual and community levels.
Thank you, Maesy. And I should say that accolades are pouring in for your keynote on all channels in front of me here. And while we have you, we actually have a question for you. And I think you're absolutely right about the relationship between the government and the community and the individual. I think as humanitarian agencies, there is often a bit of a tussle between the humanitarian imperative and functional sovereign immunity of, for example, UN agencies, which means that they are not necessarily as bound by national law as other agencies, versus this sort of fidelity to localized governance. The question that we have here is most UN agencies were formed in the 1940s and 50s. So a simple question for you to answer here: how can we decolonize the UN system?
Oh, such a simple question. Let me give it to you in 2 minutes. I think, one of the extraordinary things about the UN system, as someone who has been in it, who has really used its processes and systems and a lot of the wisdom that's come from it, and also has it, as you can see, a tough love critique of it, is that it's one of the only truly multilateral systems we have, if not the only one right now. It is, of all the large political and economic institutions that govern our world, it's the only one that is still one country, one vote. Of course, at the level of country, we know that our own countries oppress us and colonize us internally. So this is much more complex than simply at the level of nation. So there's something about that multilateralism that we have to preserve, and at the same time recognize that that one vote means very different things in different contexts, that that civil society participation in the UN system has deep power on the one hand and none at all in the others. So there are many different ways in which the UN embodies the inequities of our world. But if we can start with, unlike a lot of people who want to shut down the UN, actually re-look at the UN. What does, in the world of, all of our tech evangelists, Web 2.0 and Web 3.0, what does UN 2020 look like, right? And going forward. And having very, very systematic and honest conversations about power within the UN is where to start. and I don't know where it will end.
Absolutely. And I do want to offer any other panelist who has a view on that rather large, several rather large questions so far, haven't we? But if anyone else wants to say something about that, please feel free to do so. I also want to throw in one other question, which is, can you give some examples of a localized technology development that does demonstrate good practice when it comes to using digital algorithms in a humanitarian setting? And we've got about 4 minutes, so if you could keep your comments brief, but that's to any panelist.
I might as well pitch in here. Just that again, with regard to what Learn Asia has been doing and ourselves with telco data, that there's so many benefits that could be utilized from this and applied for humanitarian action where so that's one aspect that we saw is very important, but the controls on this from the corporations is also very much limiting for humanitarian agencies to be able to access. So that's one aspect that I feel needs a United Nations sort of front in being able to negotiate global sorts of agreements similar to what we have for satellite imagery. So when there is a natural disaster occurring anywhere around the world, all satellites are able to, data from satellites are able to be accessed. This is not something that we have in place for telco companies. Just yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm watching the mute buttons. I have one final question for you, which I'd like to put to each of you and have you each pop back on to give me the answer, if you would. I promise it's a more straightforward question, which is, I'm sure many in the audience are wondering what we can individually do on Monday to walk into the office or Sunday and say, and do something to decolonize both the robots and the humanitarian system. So if there is one thing that you might suggest that we all do, or it just gives people some ideas, it might not be one thing that everyone must do, but perhaps an idea for someone to really pick up and run with on Monday morning or Sunday morning when they go to the office or sit down at their desk in their house, given that we are in a pandemic. So perhaps, Philip, I might start with you and put you on the spot, if that's all right. It's your first on.
Yeah, very much on the spot. Thank you. It's a good question. I would think one of the things is to avoid the assumption that everybody knows the system and where the power lies. So to help people understand where digital is coming from, who controls it, who owns it or thinks they own it, and what we can do to challenge that and to tackle it at different levels.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Petra, how about you?
So yeah, I mean, this is an age where everybody's into the innovations and finding new solutions, and it just as I said in the talk, the recorded talk was, if you can do it, you still need to think about should you do it, and all of those dimensions that Anasuya talks about, I think is critical. So we need to develop that ethical framework around digital innovations.
Absolutely. Anna, how about you? What's one thing that someone could go and do next week in their job that would decolonize the system?
It's one of our core advocacies in the Computer Professionals Union is the switch from proprietary software to open source software. I think it's a small step, but it has a big impact because, as we all know, the big tech companies are all proprietary. We don't know how their algorithms work. We can all try to switch to open source systems like Ubuntu, LibreOffice. It's not a big kick, but if a lot of us do it, I think it will have a big impact. Like for previously, Linux and Ubuntu wasn't a very popular open source system, but now a lot of servers, a lot of users are using them to the point that even Microsoft has shifted to a kernel that is open source. So I think it's a small thing that each and every one of us can do.
Thank you, Anna. And Anasuya, let's have you finish us off with this question.
Well, as someone who's been an Ubuntu user from 2005, yes, Anna. Ubuntu is a good philosophical way to answer this question as well. For every meeting that you have on Monday, how about asking yourselves the questions, asking ourselves the question, how far is this room we sit in? It's going to be a virtual room because we're all in virtual rooms at this moment. How far is the room we sit in from the communities that we are talking about? That's the question.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So don't assume everyone understands where the power is. Ask, should I do this? Not can I do this? Switch to open source. And in every meeting, how far is this room from the community that we're serving? And bringing us back beautifully to the idea we heard in the opening keynote yesterday of Ubuntu. Thank you very much for that, everyone. What a wonderful panel. I'm sorry it's so brief. We can find you all on the internet, I'm sure. And I hope that you will be able to connect with folks in the audience. I know everyone really very much appreciated this. We're now going to go to a break, which is going to be slightly truncated because, of course, we had too much fun this morning. But we're going to reconvene at 2:10 p.m. No, yes, 2:10 p.m. UK time, and you will have to come out of this session in the Adventure platform and go into the next session. So we'll leave this slide up for a bit, and then you'll meet us in the new session at 2:10. Thank you very much, everybody.